Good afternoon. My name is Justice, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to this MHS webinar, Achieve Equitable Identification, Universal Assessments, and Local Norms. We are thrilled to have you here today, and we would like to begin by telling you a bit about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted, data-driven solutions across our core disciplines: clinical, education, talent development, and public safety. Science and research are the basis of MHS's roots and future innovations. With new standards for toolsets, we help clients evaluate, track, and leverage human-centric data to help realize full potential. We are guided by a clearly articulated digital trust framework to ensure that the rights and privacy of our clients are always protected. We strive for fairness and equity in the development and deployment of the products we make, the solutions we provide, and the people we lead. MHS Education specializes in providing the expertise and the resources required to help children and adolescents reach their full potential in and beyond the classroom. Dr. Jack Naglieri is an emeritus professor at George Mason University. He has published 23 books, 51 tests and rating scales, and 300 research papers. He is known for his emphasis on innovative tests, including the Naglieri General Ability Tests, verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative, the cognitive assessment systems, the autism spectrum rating scales, and the comprehensive executive function inventory. He emphasizes equitable assessments and uniting sound theory with practice. Dr. Dina Brulles is the Gifted Program Coordinator at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Her work emphasizes equitable identification and programming in gifted education. She is one of the authors of Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests, A Call for Equity in Gifted Education, and the Naglieri Ability Test Verbal. Dr. Kimberly Lansdowne, Founding Executive Director at the Herberger Young Scholars Academy at Arizona State University, received the 2023 Arizona Association for Gifted and Talented Lifetime Achievement Award. She is an active leader in gifted education advocacy, both locally and internationally. She has published extensively, including co-authoring the Naglieri General Ability Test Quantitative. Now over to our presenters.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jack Naglieri. Very pleased to be here with my colleagues. We are looking forward to sharing ideas with you and hearing what you have to say along the way. We will pause after each segment to give people the opportunity to ask a question at that point, as well as the other mechanism that was described earlier. So let's get started. Notice that you have our email addresses here. Feel free to email us at any time. We are happy to hear from you and help answer any questions that you may have in the future. Also, take advantage of the website, NaglieriGiftedTests.com. There's a lot of information there, a lot of information that will be helpful for you in going forward. So take advantage of that. You can see on the left-hand side here, that's what that website looks like. And if you are interested in twice exceptional children, then it would make sense to go to my other website, jacknaglieri.com. Again, these websites are designed to provide you with free information. Everything is free on these websites, and hope that you'll take advantage of that. Obviously, this is a webinar that is sponsored by MHS. I first started working with MHS quite a number of years ago when we published the Autism Spectrum Rating Scale, and then the Executive Function Rating Scale called the CEFI, and now the three gifted tests. So I'm very happy and proud to work with such a good company. So these are the three basic points that we're going to address here today. Why are we here? What did we discover over time? And how did that leave us to the solutions that we've created? That's the basis of what we're going to do today. So let's start with that. And with that, Dina?
So a lot of times in our field, we say gifted and talented. And depending on what state you're living in, you might have different terms like highly capable, advanced academics, just plain gifted, just plain talented. So I'd like to give our definitions of these terms, gifted and talented. And what you're going to see in our work today is that we refer to gifted as students that are very smart, which means they might have a lot of high potential, but some of them might not be very accomplished, because that's really the definition of talent. Talented students have some skills developed. So here's one definition that we like a lot. If you ask 100 people in our field how they define gifted and talented, you would probably have 100 different responses. But this one from Francois Gagné speaks to the differences that I was just mentioning. Giftedness, he says that giftedness designates the possession and use of untrained and spontaneously expressed natural abilities in at least one area. By contrast, talent designates superior mastery of systematically developed skills or knowledge in at least one area. So from this definition, you will see there's some kids that will be identified as gifted based on the potential, those natural abilities, and that's why we want to identify them so we can help them gain some of those accomplishments, academic accomplishments. But a lot of times we need to see that potential first. And our tests are designed to really promote that thought process and help teachers be aware of some of these kids that have that natural ability, that potential, so that we can help develop that into academically advanced students. By contrast, the other thing here is there's going to be some kids that are talented that will not identify as gifted. But another way to look at this, and you may have seen this chart, it's been around for many decades, initially created by Janice Sabos, who created it as a gifted coordinator to help her teachers understand and look for the differences between these talented and gifted children. In this chart, we're calling the bright child and the gifted child. And a lot of people confuse these two or combined them. A lot of these bright children might not be identified as gifted, and gifted might not show some of the traits or the attributes of who we call talented kids or bright kids. And if you scroll down that list, you're going to see one thing that stands out. These bright kids, a lot of times those are the accomplished kids. They do school well. School's designed for them to do well. And they're really the easier child to have in class if you're a teacher, because they're very advanced academically. They get things quickly. They learn with ease. They like school. School is designed for them to be successful. And so they enjoy school a lot. But gifted kids, sometimes they're outside of that, where we call average. And so a lot of these kids, you'll also recognize some of these traits, that they ask a lot of questions. They're very curious. They go into detail. They're abstract thinkers. Very few repetitions to master a new concept. They like to draw inferences. A lot of these kids initiate projects without always seeing the completion of them, because they have a lot of interest and background, and they go deeper. Then they go into the next thing that interests them. So if you go through, if you think of along those lines, that's why we want to draw your attention to these different characteristics of bright kids and gifted kids. So when you think about gifted learners, a lot of George Bett's work, his research showed that those kids that we see are gifted and talented really make up about 18% of all gifted students. There's a lot of different profiles of gifted learners. And the one thing that they all do have is that they have the high ability. So we're going to be talking a lot about general ability throughout this presentation, but all of these kids, that creatively gifted child, that perfectionistic, the highly and profoundly, the culturally and linguistically diverse child, or that EL student, that multilingual student, the twice exceptional. You probably all know some non-productive gifted students, right? And there's a reason why they might be non-productive, because maybe they don't feel accepted or understood for who they are. So as a former gifted coordinator, as with Kim, we want to try to find that potential in all these different faces of giftedness, because these are some of the kids in these categories are the kids that are not identified, not recognized, because we don't always see that potential that they have, because some of the other traits obscure some of those traits. So when we talk about general ability, it's really what allows us to solve different kinds of problems. It involves reasoning and connecting ideas across different domains, making insights, seeing connections, seeing relationships between information. And isn't that what we do in school? We provide new information that connects to some of the previous learned information. So when we talk about general ability, we're talking about this holistically. It might not be verbal, quantitative, or non-verbal. It might be any one of those or a combination of them. But the one thing that you will hear throughout this presentation is that those are all different ways to measure general ability. And the key to measuring general ability in a way that it's not confounded by previously acquired information or knowledge.
So let's talk about kind of the big picture to get us all on the same page about what exactly we mean when we talk about general ability and how it can be assessed. If you understand the way that intelligence tests are created, it gives you a very important perspective on a lot of issues, especially on equity. The most widely used tests in gifted, the group administered tests, but also the individually administered tests, measure students' knowledge of words and includes arithmetic word problems and things like that. That raises a very important question. It actually raised a very important question for me personally in 1975, when I was working as a school psychologist at Champaign Elementary, that's pictured there in New York. I was just a beginning school psychologist, 25 years old, and I did what I was taught to do. I gave a whisk and I gave an achievement test. And I can still remember so vividly how odd it seemed that I would be asking a child to define words on the intelligence test and define words on the achievement test. And the student was asked to do arithmetic word problems on the intelligence test and the achievement test, and so on. And it bothered me, and it didn't make sense. It just didn't feel right. When after working for several years, and I went to get my doctoral degree down at the University of Georgia with Alan Kaufman, author of the KBC and the KT and other tests. Alan was at the time saying that the verbal part of the whisk was really achievement. And that made a lot of sense to me. I graduated with my degree. I went to Northern Arizona, and there, as a professor, we also did some assessments. We went into this local school district. In this case, it was a Havasupai school district in the Grand Canyon. And we went in there to help try to understand why some students were having troubles. And I still have the report that I wrote in 1981 about this girl, and her scores are quite extreme across these two content areas, the verbal tests and what we used to call performance tests. Now it would probably be called nonverbal. If you look at the verbal test information, similarities, arithmetic, vocabulary, on those tests, she had a score of 52. So to give you an understanding, that's like intellectual disability level. But on the so-called performance or nonverbal tests, she was very average, a score of 95. My colleagues at the university were not very impressed when I wrote that that verbal score should not be used as a measure of intelligence because the student speaks mostly Supai language and little English. They said to me, Jack, you don't really understand. You're new here. You know, people who live out in the desert, they need to have really good spatial, so their right brains are stronger than their left brains and all this kind of stuff. And I just didn't buy it. I said, no, that doesn't make any sense. So I wrote my first article on test equity in 1982, the title being, does the WISC measure intelligence for non-English speaking children? Answer, no. Today, the WISC-5 still has those same subtests. It hasn't really changed, just cosmetically, really. So I decided to do something, and that something was to build a test of intelligence that would not include information similarity, vocabulary, and all that kind of stuff. And so in 1985, I published my first test called the Matrix Analogies Test, which was renamed as the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, the third most widely used test to identify gifted children, by the way. One of the really great things about being a test author is you have access to so much data. And so what I did with every single one of these editions of my tests as they evolved over time is I asked the important questions. Do you get race differences? Do you get differences across ethnicity? Do you get differences by sex? The answer to all of those was no. And do you have good basic validity? In other words, do you correlate with achievement? The answer was yes. So this initial research that I did from 85 till really to present convinced me that measuring ability using test questions that would help us understand how well a student can think to solve a problem was an equitable way to measure general intelligence, or sometimes referred to as little g. I'd like to give you an example, a very specific example. Look at this, the typical matrices item. In order to answer this question, a person has to look at this relationship and this one to figure out what the answer might be. And I'm sure that you see that the answer is number 2. So basically what do we have here is an analogy. White circle becomes blue circle, white square becomes blue square. Now, the same cognitive structure is found in this analogy. Girl is to woman as boy is to, of course, man. See, it's also an analogy. I'll give you another one, a mathematics one. 3 is to 6, is 5 is to 10, doubling. But now I'll give you one that if anyone can answer, please put it in the chat box right away. Now, what is this? It's musical notation. C7 refers to a chord, a C major 7th chord, and that chord, it really takes you to the chord F, like E7 takes you to the chord A. That's how music works. I was a professional musician before I became a psychologist. And C7 to F sounds like this, da, da. And E7 to A sounds like this, da, da. You can't answer it, unless you have the knowledge. But the basic structure of the thinking is the same, whether it's circles and squares, words, math, or musical notation. So what we do with our new tests is we measure thinking in a way that's not confounded by knowing. So when you look at anything that a student does, you should always ask you these two questions. What does the student need to know to answer the question? Like the musical one, most of you would have failed. But how does the student have to think? That's all about relationships. So let's take this another step and evaluate where we are in terms of intelligence tests that we use. And to do that, we need to talk a little bit about the history. Now, I know you've heard about Alfred Binet. Of course, the Stanford Binet has been around for a while, since 1916, actually. But I bet you don't know something about Alfred Binet. He created 3 collections of questions that could be used to evaluate students to see how smart they were. When Binet was creating his final edition, he took out from the previous version items that depended too much on school learning. So in other words, Binet recognized the importance of measuring a student's ability in such a way that's not going to give a student who has a lot of learning opportunity to get a higher score than a student who didn't have that same learning opportunity. Now, what happened? Binet actually passed not long after his 1911 scale, but Terman comes along, and Louis Terman decided that intelligence at the verbal and abstract level was the highest form of mental ability. I would argue he arrogantly inserted all that stuff into his 1916 Stanford Binet. Notice there's no discussion about a theory driving what questions or what the questions should be. Terman really created a problem, and Binet knew what the problem was. So Terman really, I would say, degraded Binet, and that was really important because Terman's student, Arthur Otis, of Otis Lennon, he became instrumental in the development of the Army mental testing program. So when World War I started, there were a lot of psychologists who came together and said, we want to help the war effort, and we want to come up with tests that could be used to evaluate many recruits, and the people who were smarter went to officer training school, and the people who weren't as smart, well, didn't go to officer training school. And they had 2 tests, what we'll call the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. The Army Alpha was a verbal and quantitative kind of stuff, and the Beta was what we would kind of call nonverbal. And that's basically the format of the Otis Lennon and the COGAT. But here's the important part. David Wexler was a 24-year-old military examiner who worked in Fort Logan, Texas. And you can see whose signature I have on the second page of the book Army Mental Test by Yoakum and Yerkes. That was the short version of the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And Wechsler built his Wechsler-Bell view based upon what was in the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. So think about this for a second. Wechsler wasn't really creative. He didn't make all those tests. He really took them from the Army Mental Testing book. And if you really want to dig into this more, if you put in Army Mental Tests, Yoakum and Yerkes, into a Google search, you can get a PDF of that actual book. And if you open it up and look at a Wechsler scales, you see the same questions. So we have this verbal and this kind of nonverbal. The nonverbal term is often used to describe these tests like block design and things like that. And that influenced the WISC and the WJ and the COGAT and the Otis Lennon. That's where all these tests came from. What did Wechsler think about intelligence? Well, look at his definition. The aggregate or global capacity of the individual to act purposefully, think rationally, deal effectively with his environment. That's Wechsler's 1939 definition. In the foreword to the Wechsler nonverbal scale, which I was and have been a co-author with Wechsler to develop, I asked Alan Kaufman to write the foreword, and Kaufman reminded us that Wechsler believed that those two parts, the verbal and the nonverbal parts, they represented different ways to measure general ability. And Wechsler never believed in verbal intelligence or nonverbal intelligence. He saw the performance scale, the nonverbal stuff that we would call it, as the most sensible way to measure general intelligence with people with limited proficiency in English. Now, why is this important? So obviously I've been doing this for a really long time, and a lot of people would often say to me, well, Dr. Naglieri, you have a nonverbal test. What about the verbal intelligence part of it? And isn't nonverbal intelligence also, and they would attribute the word intelligence to these verbal and nonverbal distinctions, which are really a description of the content of the test. Now, if we look at all the different tests that are out there, group and individually administered, and we ask the question, do they demand knowledge in the actual questions? The answer is yes, quite a lot. The Stanford Binet, the WISC-5, a lot of the WJ, the KBC, the OLSAT, the COGAT, they all have questions that demand knowledge. Now, that's not it. That's not all. Then you have oral instructions. COGAT has 45 pages of oral instructions with verbal concepts that kids may or may not know. And then, of course, kids have to be able to articulate their answer if it's an individually administered test. Now, let's look at the kinds of tests that are, in fact, used to identify gifted. COGAT, that's just a group-administered Wechsler. Wechsler scales. Third most popular is the Naglieri nonverbal. And then WJ, ITBS achievement test, and Otis Lennon. So these main tests that are being used, all of them except mine, are going to be influenced by opportunity to learn. Why is this a problem? Because you've probably heard famous people say, well, you can use the WISC or the COGAT or the Binet or so on and so forth. You can use them to identify gifted kids because they don't have test bias. Well, here's the thing. Test fairness has two components. Test bias is one of them, and it's important. But test equity is equally important. And what do we mean by equity? According to the standards for educational and psychological testing, equity is related to the content of the test. So if a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content in a test of intelligence, that test may be considered unfair because the student obviously can't answer it, not because they're not smart enough, but just because they didn't learn it. Like you didn't learn the musical analogy that I gave you, right? You didn't have the opportunity to learn music in order to answer that. So this is very important. Equity is the piece. Equity is related to test content. And how do you know if a test has a problem with equity? You look at the average score differences by groups. In other words, what's the average score for this group versus that group? Now, this is a very busy image to look at. And if you want to just kind of get the big picture, you can just follow the two red arrows, and you'll see at the top, traditional tests that require knowledge by race, 9, by ethnicity, 6. What do these numbers mean? These are standard score differences in their average scores. And if you notice, all of these tests are the tests that demand knowledge. Now, when we look at this lower red arrow, second generation tests that require minimal knowledge, you get half the difference by race and even less than half, or basically half by ethnicity as well. And what do we see at the bottom? Naglieri General Ability Tests. That's important. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So this is all the research I could find on race and ethnic differences for these group and individually administered tests. And the citations are all noted in the text on the bottom left. Okay, so let's take another step. What's the practical impact of this? So does it really matter? Sure does. It matters to the 1.25 million kids of color in our schools right now who are smart enough to be gifted but aren't, and they're not because of those tests that I just showed you. So this comes from our book, Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests. And we just went to the internet, got the number of kids in public ed, figured 8% of those kids by race and ethnicity, the 92nd percentile could be considered gifted. And then we found out how many of those kids were, in fact, in gifted programs and the difference between them. And so you can see white kids a little overrepresented by 30,000 and everybody else 1.25 million. Wonderfully smart kids who feel alienated and not appreciated. Just to give you kind of a sense of this, make it a little more visceral, I was playing around with what if we had elementary kids and they just held hand and stretched out. How far would 1,266,708 kids connect from Denver to San Francisco? Just think about that, though. Each one of these little images has 20,000 kids. 20,000 wonderful, smart kids in our schools who are not seen or appreciated. And of course, the opposite problem if at the lower end, over-identification. And we as school psychologists need to do a better job of that. I talk a lot about that topic as well. And then COVID comes along. So now let's think about this. What happens in COVID? Kids haven't learned. You really need post-COVID norms. So the test you choose determines the results you receive. The decisions you make about the future of a person. That's the practical impact of test selection. So I'm going to pause there. And this is a time for you to respond or question about this first segment.
Hi, so we have a question from Trish. She's asking, how can you measure verbal intelligence with a test with no words?
That's a great question, Trish. And when we show you, you're just going to smile. We're going to show you that very shortly. And that's the same question, by the way, that my colleagues Dina and Kim asked me when I said, I have an idea how to do it.
Let me further that.
Okay.
One day, many years ago, we were at a conference presenting on something, and Jack says, there's got to be a way for us to measure verbal ability with kids that don't speak English and math for the same reason. And Kim and I looked at each other and said, okay, sure, Jack, when you come up with that solution, just let us know. And literally 10 years later, he called us and said, okay, I've got it figured out. We got to work on this together. So that's how the part of our journey began.
Oh, what a great question. Thanks, Dina, for telling the whole story. Any other questions?
They're asking, in your data on kids that are not being identified as gifted and talented, the guidelines from NAGC and the state, we get a lot of people of color with cognitive data. Unfortunately, we cannot get the required academic data / behavioral data required by our state guidelines.
So this is the way that knowledge interferes with identification of really smart kids who can become very knowledgeable if given opportunity. So I'm going to pause and let Dina and or Kim speak to this question because they've lived that for a long time.
That's why we have underrepresentation, basically, which was the whole premise from what we were discussing to begin with. But schools usually have the academic data because they're required to report that on students and collect that. When we talk about cognitive, that's the other side. That's the ability and the how a child thinks and processes information. And that's what we're going to go into a little bit more when we talk about the construct of our tests. But you're right. It's hard sometimes because a lot of times schools have that achievement data, and they don't have the other piece, which is critical in order to identify the potential some of these kids have.
Thank you, Dina. Any other questions we can move forward?
John Carroll demonstrated that GC is a component of general intelligence. So what do we make of it finding light in equity issues?
Hey, that's a very complicated question, but I'll answer it in a simple way. There is a lot of controversy in our field. I'm speaking as a psychologist now, where some psychologists believe that knowledge is intelligence. I completely disagree with that. I don't think it's justifiable. Oftentimes, they'll justify it by saying, well, all these verbal questions correlate really highly with achievement. And I say, because that's what it is. But I think that'll become a little more clear as we go forward. So let's take a few more steps and tell you about our journey.
So I would love to know who all of you are right now, and if we were live and could see all of you, I would ask all of you how many of you are gifted coordinators. And so, from the lens of a gifted coordinator, I want to describe our beginnings. So Dina and I were in neighboring school districts 20 years ago in the state of Arizona. We were on the Arizona Association for Gifted, the board. And we were very, very much struggling with a concern that I believe all of you gifted coordinators are going to agree with. We were in our districts over-identifying a certain population and very much under-identifying other populations. And so we were really struggling with how can we make our representation more not only equitable, but our representation that mirrored our schools. And that was a really big issue for us. And so we flew across the country to Washington, D.C., and we went to a SING conference, Supporting the Emotional Needs of Gifted. And while we were there, we together, the two of us, gifted coordinators, we decided we were going to go and listen to Jack Naglieri's 1 hour long talk on the NNAT, the nonverbal ability test. And we really did challenge him as to how this works. What could we expect? And so we went back to our districts with this very, I'm not sure, we were concerned, will this really work? And so we went back to our districts in 2004 and started using the NNAT, and we're really pleasantly surprised that we began to find students that for our gifted programs that mirrored the population in our schools. And isn't that exactly what all of us want to do as coordinators of gifted programs? So we want you to know we have walked in your shoes. We know what those concerns are. And since 2004, we have spent a great deal of time and research, as Jack has just pointed out, coming up with these assessments, these tests. And so we would like to take the time right now to describe them to you. So the Naglieri General Ability Tests, Dina is the co-author of the verbal, and she is going to answer that really nicely worded question that you all just had. Jack is going to talk about the nonverbal, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the quantitative. So just let's move on from here. We just want you to know that, again, I think I've already said this, but we explicitly made these tests for equitable identification. We very much were looking for the diverse cultural, linguistic, and really that socioeconomic background was a very near and dear to my heart. And so that was really important for us. So we came up with these 3 different formats, and we wanted them to measure general ability. And so we wanted test questions. Our number one thing was that we wanted test questions that didn't require academic knowledge. We wanted verbal and quantitative questions that could be solved in any language. Animated instructions, remove the need for all of those very complex instructions that we're reading for other assessments. We wanted multiple choice response for the need for verbal expression. We didn't want kids to have to verbalize their answers. Online administration, and then universal assessment. We're going to talk a little bit as we go through this about using local norms or using national norms. So all of those things we were working at from 2016 to 2022. So I'm going to turn this over to Dina to describe the verbal component.
Okay, so like I said, when Jack posed that question, how do we measure verbal ability with kids don't speak English? And we just thought he was like, his head was spinning. But didn't understand that. But the more he looked into it, when he called and said, I have a solution, he was basically referring, based a lot of this on Alexander Luria's, he's a specialist in cognitive language cognition. And his theory was called the superlative fourth, where there's certain things that are connected with each other and things that aren't. So everybody has some basic understanding of universal concepts. So basically all of the items that were written, and there were hundreds, and analyzed by MHS's amazing researchers to come up with just these 30 that we have on each on those tests, multiple other ones in the background, of course. But what they all have to do is they're using pictures of objects of universally understood concepts. and that they don't rely on academic knowledge, but the student needs to look at them and study them and try to figure out what that concept might be and which one doesn't hold true to that concept. So in this one, so they're always looking at the relationships among pictures. And when I was describing to you at the beginning about general ability, and I said that relates to how students make connections and see relationships between ideas and information, especially like what's learned in school. But to take out that academic knowledge, what we wanted to use was simple with no words, of course. And so this is an example of a type of a test item that we would show on a verbal test. Your student will see these 6 pictures, and then they'll have to think through them, which one is really different. So we have these things that we call distractors. So that means that you might look at this and say, there's only one that's really vibrantly colored, and this is this blue bowl. There's 2 that have a handle. The box is the only one that can close, whereas the basket has holes in it. It's woven. But the one thing is they show is that they are all empty except for number 2, the glass with the beverage. So the idea, the concept here is empty. And so the student must identify what that concept is and which one does not adhere to that rule. And as Kim was just mentioning, we also wanted to develop these in a way that we don't have to say directions to the student. So this is an example of how the student is going to learn how to take this test. You see him thinking the thought bubbles. All the kids know thought bubbles. Now focusing in on those items. And they group together to show them that there is one that is different. Obviously, they're all fruit except for the chair. That is what the child sees when they're taking the test. Then they go back and he makes a mistake. He picks the peach, but it shows that and how to correct that. So he selects the chair, then goes on to the forward button, and all of that is showing him that how to take this, how to think about it, how to choose an answer, how to correct it, and then how to move forward. And the system won't let you move forward until you do collect the first one, select the correct item. So now we're going to give you a few examples of each of these types. So this is an example of a first grade easy test item. Pretty obvious that 3 is the outlier. The 3 is the only one doesn't show a living plant. Now, first grade hard one. Now we've done this live many times, and they're not easy. They get progressively more challenging as you go along, like most tests do. So the student will see all these and they'll have to say, okay, and I've heard a lot of people say, well, these 3 all can something to do, you taste or the mouth. Some people will say these have colors, these are in pairs, and these are solo items. But the one thing that they do have in common, all of these 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, is that they're handheld. You can hold them, whereas a table, you really can't hold it with one hand. So that is the concept there, handheld. Now we'll show you a 6th grade easy. What we have here are 5 animals that have antlers and 1 that has a horn. So the rhinoceros in picture number 6 is the outlier. It's the one that is not the same as the others. Now we'll show you a 6th grade harder one. So when we're in a group, when we're doing this live, we have teachers and audience participants talk about these, and it's really fun, the conversations that we see. But on this one, what we're seeing here are 6 different types of buildings. And we'll get back to it in just a second. But in those 6 type of buildings, all of them are commercial or institutions, except for 1. Number 4 is the only building here that is not a business or some type of a commercial institution. So the concept there was just that, and house The townhouse here was the only one. Now, when we're in a workshop doing this live, teachers will say, oh, but this one's colorful, but this one has some colors. This one you see a side view, I mean, an angled view. These two have steps. So what happens is that the kids will work through those and then come up with the correct answer after analyzing some of the details of that. And now we're going to move on to some of the nonverbal slides.
So the nonverbal is similar to the NNAT3 in concept, but I came up with a lot of new ways of making matrices. For me, it's just really fun. So I came up with a lot of nice ways of building matrices items. And the instructions, the animated instructions, basically the same. There's a thought bubble. The student is directed to where to look, the options, and so on. So, directions that require no words. And of course, the way you make these kind of items harder is by complexity. So obviously this is an easy item, just with a shape that gets moves down, moves around. This is a harder item where we have pieces superimposing upon each other with certain rules that have to be detected. And for the older kids, similarly easy and then harder. And still, these are pretty easy items. All right, Kim.
That's not an easy item. That was not an easy item. It is for you. It's not for the rest of us. So one thing that I did want to point out and is that time is really important, right? Time in school is really important. And if you are the gifted coordinator and you're trying to go in and get your entire second grade team to give you time for ability testing, you really, that, in my experience, that's a hard thing to get people to agree to if it's days and days and days. So time is really important to us, and that was important when we were creating the test. So Dina did mention really briefly that each component has 30 questions, or 35, what is it, 30, 35. And each one, the reason I don't know is because it'll take about 35 minutes for each of them. So important, just really important to know. Okay, the quantitative, it requires minimal academic knowledge. So there is some skill involved in understanding numbers and the relationships of numbers, but I just want to quickly show you some examples. So what comes next? 6, 7, 8, 9, it's just sequencing. And then the video that goes along with it. One of the things that I love about this, because I've stood in front of a whole group of kids and read page upon page upon page of instruction, this is it. This is it. The kids just go through this. Now, in my experience, there have been a time where a kid needs to go through it again. Big deal, they can, but it is very, very simple. And I love the silence that goes along with reading these instructions. Okay, let's keep going because it is 1 o'clock. Just wanted to point that out to everybody. So this is a first grade easy. We've already seen this in the samples. We can move on. This is a first grade hard. And I would love to take the time, but we don't have it. But I would love to take the time to have all of you very verbally reason out this problem. Instead, though, we have a 6th grade student that she has never seen this problem before. I went up to her and said to her, can you solve this problem? She just takes a look at it and just solves it so quickly and so easily. And she verbalizes it all the way through in a way that, quite honestly, as the author of, the developer of that question, I didn't think it through that way. So it's just this beautiful thing. So here's a 6th grade hard. And so
Easy.
I'm sorry, 6th grade easy. So I'm going to give you just a second to think that through. I'll give you a little clue. What's the difference between 3 and 6? And then 6 and 11. So you've got 3, and then what's next? 5. What's the difference between 11 and 18? 7. So what do you think's next? 9. And the last one is we're adding 11. So what's the answer? And it's B. Yeah. So there you go. Those are the three different types of tests in the Naglieri General Abilities Test.
So before we move on, it just occurred to me that I didn't mention a couple important things. When you're looking at the verbal, you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
That's fine. So when you're looking at those verbal tests, what we did was we did consult with 18 language experts from around the country, from different cultures. And because we wanted to make sure there was no offensive items from one culture. So for example, you will not see cows or pigs or dogs or certain things like that. We wanted to make sure the food items, the structures and everything that it didn't matter where you came from, that you would have some familiarity. The second thing is, if each of you in this webinar spoke a different language, you would have the equal opportunity to select the correct response, regardless of the language you spoke. So if you're in a class with multilingual students, this is what, and Jack's going to share with you some data with you really shortly, but this is what we found when we were producing and developing the tests and in practice as well, now that they've been out in the market for a couple of years.
So this is a time, if you want to ask a question about these tests before we move forward and share some more information with you, this would be a good time. How are you feeling? Does this make sense?
We did get a question from Samantha about the questions, or about a question about the tests. She asked, can you administer just one? What results do you get? And what if she wants to administer all three? And why would she want to give all three?
Those are really good questions. If I were to take just the quantitative, I don't have that way of thinking like Kim does when she developed those. I probably wouldn't identify, but I love words. I thrive. I think about words all the time. I just love the structure. I love all that. So I would probably do really well on that. In Jack, as his background of developing nonverbal tests, he would do very well on any of those types. My point here is that the more of the tests that you give, the more students you're going to catch because of the way they think differently, and they make relationships between ideas and information in the different domains a little bit differently. So you're going to be able to identify a lot more students that if you give all three of the tests, but you can give one or a combination of two different ones, but I caution you that that's what they find. And MHS made the price structure very user-friendly, so they cost less the more that you give.
A couple of things in the manuals and such. One of the things that you're not going to be able to read all this, I'm just providing it here just to let you know that when you get information about a student, you get a lot of information about how they completed the task. How long did it take them? Did they omit questions? Did they, just give the same answer just to be done with it? So in other words, they didn't really try. Those kinds of things, all that kind of information will be included when you get the reports. And these are what the reports look like. On the left-hand side is a description of what the three tests are, the verbal, the nonverbal, and quantitative, with an example of each one. And we also have a description of what the scores mean, percentiles, day 9, standard score, and so on. And then on the right, here is where the individual students' scores will be rendered, and all the information when they were tested, percentiles, day 9, national or local standard score. Now, one of the things that is very important to me, and I know to Dina and Kim as well, but my entire career as a speaker has always been to share information, but then show evidence. And the publisher did 3 research studies on race and ethnic differences. And this paper just published actually last a couple of days ago. And what they did is they collected about 3,500 kids and gave them a nonverbal test. Now, what would I expect from there? Because of my previous research, I found that you don't get gender differences, you don't get race and ethnic differences, and we didn't get parental ed level differences. That didn't really surprise me because of my previous work, but the verbal test, I really wondered. Another sample, about 2,500 kids, no gender differences, no race, no parental ed level differences, and the same is true for the quantitative. So we got about 8,000 or 9,000 kids, K to 12, who represent the US population, 3 separate studies asking the same basic research question. If you take knowledge out of the measurement of ability, do you get equity? And the answer is most definitely.
As a former gifted coordinator, this last piece, the parental level of education, they're all awesome and they just completely incredible results. But this last one, so much of our gifted, many of our gift students that are identified and served in gifted programs, a lot of times we identify them based on zip code, right? Based on where they live in their community and their past experiences and the opportunities that they've had prior to coming into school and during school as well. We all know that. We see it all the time. But think about this. A child can have 2 parents that are migrant farm workers and 2 parents that are engineers and doctors or lawyers and have the same opportunity to demonstrate how they think, how they process information, the connections they make, which relates to their potential for learning. That is incredible to me.
We also have in the manual evidence of children who speak English or don't speak English. And again, we get very small differences, virtually no real difference there. Same thing for this particular study across the 3 tests, very small differences.
And once again, as a former bilingual teacher and EL teacher, I would see really smart kids. You see that spark in their eyes, you see the way they're thinking, and they don't speak enough English to be able to demonstrate that processing of information. So this was another key piece to our test that that can really make a big difference on who we're serving and how teachers are looking at some of these students. And like Jack said at the beginning, how can impact their future and their education.
And similar scores by gender as well. All right. Also in the manual, there's a lot of psychometric stuff if you're interested in all that. And if you have any questions, you can always email me or we can talk about it. But there's a lot there. Now, keep in mind, we have normed these 3 tests on samples of children after COVID. We're the only test of general ability that has post-COVID national norms. Just a little tidbit. All right, I think we talked about this already in terms of 1 versus 2 or 3 of the tests. I strongly encourage people to use all 3. You will find more children that way. I'm working on a research paper on this very topic, and that's exactly what I found. I just haven't rendered it yet.
Very briefly, I talked earlier about the fact that as a coordinator of gifted programs, one of the biggest issues that we have had, and it's been an issue for a very long time, is equitable identification in regards to the school mirroring with the population. So national norms, we've used national norms forever and ever and ever. And what that does is it compares a student to other kids across the nation. I've been in a lot of schools. I rarely have had a school that the population of the school looks like the national population. So we would like to encourage you, and this is a beautiful, beautiful way for you to start that identifying kids in regards to the school population, and it's called local norms. So what you're going to do, and you can use national norms, you can still do that. You can take a look at both of them if you wish to. But local norms are when you are comparing a student to the local group. So this group in the school, and you're trying to decide in that school, what's your cut score? Is it 97, 98, 99? Or can you look at maybe the top 10 kids that maybe your highest percentile score is the 90th percentile, but they're still the very top kid. And when we're looking at gifted programming, Dina's going to talk about in just a second, you want to find the kid that is so different from the mean that they need different, faster programming. So local norms, please take a look at local norms. The people at MHS, they are so like experts in this, and they can walk you through it. So consider using local norms. We strongly encourage it. So now, Jack, you can go to 72, please.
This is a question that Kim and I and Jack, we get all the time when we are presenting. What if these kids that we are identifying using these tests don't fit into my gifted program, right? We have to remember that we are in charge of creating our gifted programs. And if we're finding kids that are far removed from the norm, like Kim was talking about, at a certain school, and we have a gifted program that doesn't serve those kids, then we need to do something differently. We're identifying kids that in a more equitable way. That means we have to serve them in a more equitable way. And that might mean that we need to expand our views of procedures and practices and guidelines for entrance criteria. So we've talked about multiple measures, but what we really need to think about is multiple pathways for serving those students. And I'm a strong proponent for creating a continuum of services, because once we identify these kids, somebody might identify on all three areas plus have high achievement in many areas, and some might identify on one or two and not have that achievement. We can't then expect that we're going to help them progress academically in the same exact way. We have to be more flexible in how we're working with these students. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I call it the gifted programming dilemma. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? A lot of times what schools do is we find a gifted program, or we have a gifted program that we really like, and then we look for students that will do well in that program. Where I say so we cherry pick who we're going to select in based on our program. And I like to take the opposite approach. What I like to do is I like to identify the kids based on their potential and then decide how we're going to serve them. And so these are the four most common services, gifted services that I'm aware of: cluster grouping, honors classes, enrichment classes, and self-contained. And I'll speak to them extremely briefly. This is actually a whole presentation on it, but what we're looking at is in the order of inclusivity. Okay, so there are going to be some kids that really do have those things, what I was just talking about, that high achievement as well as the high ability. Some of those kids might need a self-contained program. Enrichment classes are good for all kids, but it's not, and for gifted students, it's a very common way of serving them. And I'm for that as well, but we need to tie it to core curriculum. And the only way we can do that, if you have an enrichment class, which is a pull out or a push in or something like that, is to cluster group them first and then provide some of that. So in my experience as a coordinator, and I know Kim had the same thing, we had all of these programs. because we know that some kids are going to be ready for certain programs at different times than other students are. So the basic thing we want to do, we want to encourage everybody to do, and Kim and I do a whole presentation just on cluster grouping using local norms following our testing. And that's because once we identify these kids with high potential, high ability, we know that we want to group them together. We want to treat them as if they were gifted and talented, because that's how we can help develop some of that potential that they've already demonstrated that they have. So if we put them together, group them, all the gifted students together in one grade level, it's usually maybe 4, 6, 8. It's not a self-contained, but at least they have the opportunity to learn along with others that have that high intellectual ability, high potential, and are placed with a teacher who is understands who these kids are, how to make them feel accepted, understood for who they are, and for what they're capable of learning. So a lot of this is contingent upon providing professional learning opportunities for the teacher who is going to be that cluster grouping teacher at that grade level. So look at it. Look for us if you're going to be at NAGC, some of our sessions or some of the state association conferences that the three of us speak at, and we will address that in much more depth. But it's also contained in our book that Jack was describing, understanding and using the results of these tests.
We need to see if there are any final questions, and then we'll be done.
We have a question here from Paula. She says, I may have missed it, but are the subtests timed? Timed tests are a pet peeve of mine on cognitive assessments for students who have processing difficulties. These kids who cannot or who can reason well, but need longer time than is typical to do so. Could Dr. Naglieri speak to this?
The tests are not timed in the way that block design or other kinds of tests are. There is a time limit. And there is flexibility in that time limit. It can be adjusted.
But so there's no subtests in these. There's just one test for verbal, one for quant, and one for nonverbal. And they, of course, they vary depending on whatever age of the student. It's not the same test, but there are no subtests like you would find in the COGAT, for example.
Okay, great. We do have another question. They ask, could the Naglieri General Ability Test alone be used to identify students for highly capable services? So often it is assumed that students must also demonstrate prior academic ability, especially on some sort of standardized test.
That's a great question. These are 3 standalone measures of general ability, and the research was done separately for each of those tests. So if you would need to use multiple measures, you could use 3 of these tests as 3 different measures for measuring general ability. They are standalone also in the identification of giftedness, and the research from MHS has shown that, and that's plenty of that is there. Jack, do you want to add anything? Kim?
No, I think that you answered it very nicely. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. Thank you again for that presentation, Dr. Naglieri, Dr. Brulles, and Dr. Lansdowne. If we didn't get to any of the questions from the attendees, you can send us an email at marketing@mhs.com and we'll forward them along to our presenters or MHS staff. And as a reminder, you will receive a copy of the webinar recording in a few weeks. Thank you.
Please feel free to connect with us in any of these 5 different ways. We love to hear from you also on the website, especially as you can see the first one, Naglieri Gifted Tests. So a lot of information there. Please, you can be in touch with us and and email with us as well. So yeah, stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you.